On the morning of March 14, 1838, Dr. James Richardson arrived at the Dublin Foundling Hospital on James Street to conduct a routine inspection. What he discovered in the mortuary chamber would expose one of the most horrific cases of institutional negligence in Irish history. The room was filled with dozens of feral cats. They weren't merely present, they were feeding. Scattered across the stone floor lay the partially consumed remains of at least 17 infant bodies. Some were fresh, competent but overwhelmed man who visited the hospital 3 times weekly. His duties included examining new arrivals, treating illnesses, and certifying deaths. He signed death certificates listing causes like marasmus was wasting, convulsions, debility, and teething, all common Victorian catch-all diagnoses that revealed little. What Dr. Cusack did not do, because no one had asked him to, was inspect the mortuary where bodies awaited burial. The hospital's location on James Street placed it near the Liberties, Dublin's most notorious slum district. The streets outside teemed with beggars, prostitutes, thieves, and street children. Feral cats were everywhere, in the alleys, the courtyards, the abandoned buildings. They were so common that most Dubliners barely noticed them. Inside the hospital walls, cats had always been present too. Initially, staff welcomed them. Cats controlled rats, and rats carried disease. But over the years, the cat population had grown. They moved through the hospital freely, slipping through broken windows, squeezing under doors, breeding in hidden spaces. By early 1838, there were dozens of them, perhaps more than 100. Staff had begun noticing strange behavior. The cats congregated near the mortuary building, a small stone structure in the hospital's rear courtyard, separated from the main building. They gathered at the mortuary door, scratching and yowling. At night, the sounds were worse. The howling kept light sleepers awake in nearby wards. Several wet nurses complained. "The cats are getting aggressive," one wrote in a statement later examined by investigators. "They don't run from us anymore. They act like they own the place." Mrs. Murphy's response, according to testimony, was dismissive. "They're just cats," she said. "Feed them less and they'll catch more rats." But the wet nurses noticed something else. The cats weren't catching rats. They were well fed despite the reduced scraps from the kitchen. Their coats were sleek. They moved with the satisfied laziness of animals with an abundant food source. No one wanted to think about what that food source might be. The first documented incident occurred on January 23, 1838. A wet nurse named Mary O'Brien entered the mortuary to prepare an infant's body for burial. She found 2 cats inside the chamber, despite the door having been closed. The body, which had been placed there only hours earlier, showed signs of disturbance. The infant's burial cloth had been pulled aside. There were marks on the tiny corpse, scratches, possibly bites. O'Brien reported this to the matron on duty, who dismissed her concerns. "The child died of consumption," the matron said. "Any marks are from the disease." But O'Brien was certain. "Those marks were from teeth," she later testified. "Animal teeth, I know the difference." The incident was recorded in the day's log with a single line: "Cats found in mortuary. Door to be kept secured." 3 weeks later, on February 12th, another wet nurse discovered the mortuary door ajar. Inside, 4 cats were present. One was actively feeding on an infant corpse. The nurse, horrified, drove the cats out and secured the door. This time, she reported directly to Mrs. Murphy. The superintendent's response was to order a new lock installed on the mortuary door. She also instructed staff to check the chamber more frequently. "This is a pest control issue," she told the assembled nurses. "Nothing more." But the mortuary had no windows. The only entrance was the locked door. How were the cats getting inside? One of the older nurses, Margaret Doyle, suggested checking for gaps in the walls or foundation. Mrs. Murphy refused. "We don't have funds for unnecessary repairs," she said. "Just ensure the door remains closed." Through late February, staff noticed the cat population seemed to be increasing. They moved through the hospital in small packs, bold and unafraid. Several nurses reported being hissed at, or even scratched, when they approached groups of cats near the mortuary building. They were defending something, one nurse later told investigators. The way they acted, it was territorial, like we were intruding on their space. On March 3rd, a delivery man bringing supplies to the hospital witnessed something disturbing. He saw 3 cats dragging something across the mortuary courtyard. At first, he thought it was a large rat. Then he realized it was too big, and the wrong shape. It was an infant's arm. The delivery man reported this to a nurse, who went pale and refused to discuss it. He later gave testimony that she said, "You saw nothing, do you understand? You saw nothing." Confused and disturbed, the delivery man left. But the image haunted him. He mentioned it to his wife, who urged him to report it to authorities. He didn't. In 1838 Dublin, a working-class delivery man didn't accuse a charitable institution of wrongdoing without evidence. The social cost would be too high. Inside the hospital, tension grew among the staff. The wet nurses began avoiding the mortuary building entirely. When infants died, and they died frequently, nurses would leave the bodies in a holding area and wait for male staff to transport them to the mortuary. But male staff were scarce. The hospital employed only 3 men, a groundskeeper, a maintenance worker, and a porter. They couldn't always respond immediately. Bodies began accumulating. By early March, it wasn't uncommon for 3 or 4 infant corpses to wait hours before being moved to the mortuary. They lay in a small room near the main nursery ward, covered with sheets, while life continued around them. The proximity of death to the living became normalized. One wet nurse, Sarah Collins, later testified about the psychological toll. You would be feeding a baby while knowing there were dead ones just through that door. And the cats, they could smell it. They'd gather outside that room, waiting. It felt wrong, evil even, but we needed our wages. We needed to eat, so we stayed. On March 10th, 4 days before Dr. Richardson's inspection, the hospital's porter, Thomas Kelly, was instructed to remove accumulated bodies from the holding area and place them in the mortuary. He found 7 infant corpses waiting. Kelly transported them across the courtyard in a cart. When he opened the mortuary door, he was struck by an overwhelming stench, far worse than decomposition alone. The room was dark. He could hear movement inside. Kelly later described what happened next in chilling detail. I went to light a candle, and when the flame caught, I saw them everywhere. Dozens of eyes reflecting the light. Cats. More than I could count. They were in the corners, on the shelves, on the floor. And there were bodies, infant bodies in various states. Some looked fresh. Others were reduced. Just bones and scraps of cloth. Kelly backed out of the mortuary without depositing the bodies he'd brought. He went directly to Mrs. Murphy and told her what he'd seen. Her response was to order him to clean the mortuary immediately. Remove the cats, she said. Bury whatever remains you find. We have an inspection coming next week. Kelly refused. I'm not going back in there alone, he said. Mrs. Murphy offered him extra wages. Kelly still refused. That's not right, he told her. What's happening in there? It's not right. Someone needs to answer for this. Mrs. Murphy's demeanor changed. She became cold, threatening. If you value your position, you'll do as instructed. If you speak of this to anyone outside these walls, you'll never work in Dublin again. I have connections, do you understand? Kelly understood. But he was also afraid of something beyond unemployment. He was afraid of moral culpability. That night he confided in his brother, who worked as a clerk for the Dublin Medical Society. It was this conversation that set events in motion. Kelly's brother mentioned the situation to his supervisor, who mentioned it to a colleague, who mentioned it to Dr. James Richardson, a respected physician and member of the hospital's board of trustees, though one who had been largely absent from oversight duties. Richardson decided to conduct an unannounced inspection. If this story is giving you chills, hit that like button. Share this with someone who loves dark mysteries. Let's discover what happens next. Dr. James Richardson arrived at the Dublin Foundling Hospital at 9:30 on the morning of March 14, 1838. He did not announce himself to Mrs. Murphy. Instead, he went directly to the mortuary building, accompanied by another board member, Alderman William Moore. The courtyard was quiet. A light rain had begun to fall. As Richardson and Moore approached the mortuary, they noticed several cats lounging near the door despite the weather. The cats didn't scatter. They watched the men with what Richardson later described as unnatural boldness. The mortuary door was locked. Richardson had brought keys obtained from the hospital's master records. His hands shook as he worked the lock. Later, he would admit that he expected to find nothing unusual, that he'd convinced himself Kelly's testimony was exaggerated. The door swung inward. The smell hit them first. Richardson, a physician with 20 years' experience, had encountered death in every form. But this was different. This was decay mixed with animal musk, with feces, with something else he couldn't initially identify. Moore vomited before they even stepped inside. Richardson covered his mouth and nose with a handkerchief and entered. His eyes adjusted slowly to the dim interior. Light filtered through cracks in the stone walls and around the ill-fitting door. The floor was a nightmare. Infant bodies lay scattered across the stone. Some were intact but partially consumed. Others were reduced to bones and tatters of burial cloth. Richardson counted at least 17 sets of remains, though the state of decomposition made accurate enumeration difficult. But it was the living that truly horrified him. Cats were everywhere. They filled the shelves built into the walls, shelves meant to hold bodies awaiting burial. They lounged on the floor. They perched on exposed rafters. Richardson estimated between 40 and 60 animals in the chamber, and they were feeding. A large tabby cat, its muzzle stained dark, crouched over a tiny ribcage in the corner. 2 smaller cats fought over what appeared to be an infant's leg. Others simply watched Richardson with lazy indifference, as if he were the intruder in their domain. Richardson stood paralyzed. His mind struggled to process what his eyes reported. This was a mortuary in a Christian institution, a place meant to treat the dead with dignity before burial. Instead, it had become a feeding ground for feral animals. He stepped further into the room, his boots disturbing bones that rolled with dry clicking sounds. On one shelf he found a relatively fresh body, an infant that couldn't have been dead more than 2 days. The burial cloth was intact, but the tiny face showed signs of animal attention. Bite marks around the nose and lips, an ear partially removed. More remained outside, unable to enter. "What do you see?" he called. Richardson couldn't answer immediately. His throat had closed. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse. "God help us all." He began taking mental inventory, his physician's training asserting itself despite the horror. Most of the remains showed signs of advanced decomposition, weeks old, perhaps months. The mortuary had clearly not been properly maintained or emptied for an extended period. But some bodies were fresh. One appeared to have died within the last day. It lay near the door, still wearing a name tag, a small piece of cloth pinned to the burial shroud. Richardson bent closer, careful not to disturb the cats now circling his legs. The name read, Thomas Joseph, received February 28, died March 12. 2 days ago. This child had died 2 days ago and was already being consumed by cats. Richardson's horror crystallized into fury. He turned to Moore, who stood in the doorway. "Get the constabulary, get the hospital board, get everyone, right now." As Richardson backed toward the door, he made one final observation that would haunt his testimony later. On the highest shelf, barely visible in the gloom, lay a single infant body that appeared completely untouched by the cats. It was wrapped carefully, professionally, in clean burial cloth. Richardson wondered why the cats had left this one alone. Then he realized the body had been placed recently, probably within hours. The cats hadn't reached it yet, but they would. Outside, Richardson bent over and vomited into the rain-soaked courtyard. Moore stood beside him, pale and shaking. Neither man spoke for several minutes. Finally, Richardson straightened. "How many?" Moore asked. "How many bodies?" "At least 17 I could identify," Richardson said. "But there are bones, fragments. It could be far more. Dozens, perhaps." Moore looked toward the main hospital building, where hundreds of infants currently resided in the care of Mrs. Murphy and her staff. What kind of person allows this? Richardson had no answer. Not yet, but he intended to find one. Within an hour, the mortuary was cordoned off. Constables arrived. Board members gathered. A full investigation was ordered. As the rain intensified, workers began the grim task of removing remains from the mortuary, both animal and human. The cats resisted. They had to be driven out with sticks and loud noises. Several were killed in the process. Others scattered into the hospital's walls and grounds, where they would continue to multiply for years afterward. By nightfall, the remains of at least 23 infants had been recovered from the mortuary. The number would eventually rise to 29 as workers sifted through fragmented bones and identified smaller remains. 29 dead children, left to rot and be consumed by feral animals in a Christian charitable institution. The question everyone asked was, how did this happen? But the more important question, the one that would dominate investigations for months, was why? The Dublin Foundling Hospital investigation began in earnest on March 15, 1838, led by a special committee appointed by the Lord Mayor. The committee included Dr. Richardson, Alderman Moore, 2 additional physicians, a magistrate, and a representative from the Dublin diocese. Their first action was to inspect the entire hospital. What they found painted a picture of systematic neglect far beyond the mortuary scandal. The infant wards were overcrowded to the point of cruelty. In rooms designed for 20 cribs, investigators found 50 or 60 infants. Many shared sleeping spaces. Others lay on the floor in makeshift bedding. The smell of waste and unwashed bodies was overwhelming. The wet nurses were exhausted and demoralized. Under questioning, they revealed that Mrs. Murphy had been systematically reducing staff wages while increasing workload. Many nurses cared for 30 to 40 infants simultaneously, an impossible task. When babies died, which happened frequently, the nurses were instructed to place bodies in the holding area and continue their duties. "We couldn't mourn them," one nurse testified. "There wasn't time. Another baby would be crying, needing to be fed or changed. The dead ones just accumulated." The investigation revealed that bodies had been accumulating in the mortuary for at least 6 months. Mrs. Murphy had reduced the frequency of burials from weekly to monthly, citing budget constraints. But the hospital's financial records showed that burial funds had not been reduced. In fact, they'd slightly increased. So where had the money gone? Investigators discovered that Mrs. Murphy had been embezzling funds for years. The scheme was sophisticated. She inflated company STS for food, supplies, and services, then pocketed the difference. The burial fund was just one of many targets. She'd been stealing approximately $400 annually, equivalent to roughly $50,000 today, from an institution serving society's most vulnerable. The reduced burial frequency meant bodies accumulated faster than they could be processed. The mortuary, poorly ventilated and inadequately secured, became exactly what Richardson had discovered: a feeding ground for feral cats that had learned humans would not disturb them there. Dr. Cusack, the hospital physician, was questioned extensively. His testimony revealed a man who'd rationalized away red flags through a combination of professional trust and willful ignorance. "I never inspected the mortuary," he admitted. "That wasn't part of my duties as I understood them. Mrs. Murphy assured me that bodies were being buried promptly and properly. I had no reason to doubt her. But there had been reasons to doubt. The hospital's mortality rate, which officially stood at 40%, was actually much higher. Investigators found that Mrs. Murphy had been falsifying records, listing some dead infants as transferred to country homes or reclaimed by family. The true mortality rate approached 70%, meaning 7 out of 10 infants who entered the hospital died within weeks or months. This revelation sparked outrage throughout Dublin. Newspapers published scathing editorials. The Irish Times called the hospital a charnel house masquerading as charity. The Freeman's Journal demanded criminal prosecution and complete institutional reform. Public pressure mounted. The Lord Mayor ordered Mrs. Murphy's immediate arrest on charges of embezzlement, criminal neglect, and dereliction of duty. She was taken into custody on March 22nd. Her trial began 6 weeks later, in May 1838, at the King's Bench in Dublin. The proceedings drew massive public attention. The courtroom overflowed with spectators. Newspapers provided daily coverage. Mrs. Murphy's defense attorney argued that she was a scapegoat for systemic failures. He pointed out that the hospital board had failed to conduct proper oversight for years. He noted that chronic underfunding forced impossible choices. He suggested that Murphy's embezzlement, while wrong, was motivated by personal financial desperation rather than malice toward the infants. The prosecution presented a different picture. They showed that Murphy lived comfortably. She owned property, wore expensive clothing, and hosted regular social gatherings. They demonstrated that her embezzlement was calculated and sustained over years. Most damningly, they proved that she'd been warned multiple times about conditions in the mortuary, and had deliberately ignored those warnings. Thomas Kelly, the porter who'd first raised alarms, testified about Murphy's threats when he refused to clean the mortuary. Several wet nurses testified about their reports of cat infestations being dismissed. Dr. Richardson provided detailed testimony about the conditions he discovered. The defense attempted to argue that Murphy couldn't be held criminally responsible for cat behavior. She didn't feed infants to cats, her attorney insisted. At worst, she failed to prevent wild animals from accessing a mortuary. That's negligence, not murder. But the prosecution countered that Murphy's actions, embezzling burial funds, reducing burial frequency, ignoring repeated warnings, threatening staff who raised concerns, created the conditions that led directly to the desecration of infant corpses. She may not have personally fed these children to cats, the prosecutor argued, but her greed and indifference made their bodies food for vermin. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. They returned with a guilty verdict on all charges. Mrs. Catherine Murphy was sentenced to 10 years in prison, a harsh sentence for the time, reflecting public outrage. She served 7 years before being released in 1845. She died in poverty in 1852, her reputation permanently destroyed. Dr. Cusack was not criminally charged, but he was professionally censured by the Royal College of Physicians in Ireland. He resigned from the hospital and from medical practice entirely. He later told colleagues, "I should have looked. I should have insisted on inspecting that mortuary. I failed those children." The hospital board members who'd neglected oversight responsibilities were all forced to resign. Several faced civil suits from families who'd placed children in the hospital's care. But what about the surviving infants? What happened to the hundreds of children still in the hospital's care when the scandal broke? Initially, there was talk of closing the hospital entirely, but advocates pointed out that these children had nowhere else to go. Closing the hospital would condemn them to the streets or to equally inadequate institutions. Instead, the government seized control of the hospital from the charitable society that had run it. They appointed a new superintendent, Dr. Margaret Walsh, one of the first female physicians in Ireland and a passionate advocate for child welfare. Dr. Walsh implemented sweeping reforms. She increased staffing dramatically, hiring additional wet nurses and support staff. She improved sanitation and separated sick children from healthy ones to prevent disease spread. She instituted daily medical rounds and weekly mortality reviews. She established a proper mortuary protocol with regular burials and strict security to prevent animal access. Most importantly, she began investigating each child's background to find family members who might take them. She established what we'd now call a foster care system, placing children with rural families who were compensated for their care, a revolutionary concept at the time. Under Dr. Walsh's management, the hospital's mortality rate dropped from 70% to 25% within 2 years, still tragically high by modern standards but a dramatic improvement for the era. The mortuary building itself was demolished in 1840 and replaced with a proper burial chapel with sealed crypts. A memorial plaque was installed listing the names of the 29 infants whose remains had been recovered, though many couldn't be identified and were listed simply as unknown child. The feral cat population took years to control. The hospital hired professional rat catchers who also trapped cats, but the animals had multiplied throughout the hospital's walls and surrounding areas. Estimates suggest that several hundred cats lived in and around the hospital by 1838. It took sustained effort through the 1840s to reduce their numbers to manageable levels. Some of the wet nurses who testified during the investigation formed Ireland's first nurses' advocacy group, demanding better working conditions and clearer reporting mechanisms for institutional abuse. Their efforts contributed to nursing reforms that spread throughout British-controlled hospitals. But perhaps the most significant aftermath was the public conversation the scandal sparked about Ireland's treatment of its most vulnerable. Newspapers, clergy, and politicians debated fundamental questions. What responsibility did society have to abandon children? How should charitable institutions be overseen? What protections existed for those who couldn't advocate for themselves? These debates contributed to child welfare reforms across Ireland and Britain, including mandatory government inspections of charitable institutions, standardized record-keeping requirements, and criminal penalties for institutional negligence resulting in death. The Dublin Foundling Hospital continued operating under government control until 1935, when it finally closed. By then, Ireland had developed alternative systems for child welfare, including adoption services and state-supported family assistance. The hospital building was eventually demolished. A hoosie. NG Estate now occupies the site on James Street. But one question haunted everyone involved in the investigation and trial. Could this have been prevented? Multiple people had noticed the problem. The wet nurses who reported cats in the mortuary, the delivery man who saw cats dragging an infant's arm, the porter who discovered the feeding ground and was threatened into silence, Dr. Cusack who could have insisted on inspecting the mortuary, the board members who could have conducted meaningful oversight. At every step, someone could have acted. But the combination of institutional authority, financial precarity, social hierarchy, and willful ignorance created conditions where horror unfolded in plain sight, while being somehow invisible to those with power to stop it. The Dublin Foundling Hospital scandal didn't occur in isolation. It was symptomatic of broader systemic failures in how Victorian society dealt with poverty, illegitimacy, and child mortality. Across Britain and Ireland in the 1830s and 1840s, similar institutions operated with minimal oversight. Many would later be exposed as sites of abuse and neglect. The Dublin case became a catalyst for reform precisely because its horror was so visceral and undeniable. When cats fed on infant corpses, it created an image that couldn't be rationalized away. The middle and upper classes, who might have accepted high infant mortality among the poor as tragic but inevitable, couldn't ignore the desecration of bodies. It forced acknowledgement that something was fundamentally wrong with how society treated its most vulnerable. The scandal contributed to the passage of the Irish Poor Relief Act of 1838, which established a framework for government responsibility for the poor rather than relying solely on private charity. While imperfect, it marked a philosophical shift toward recognizing systemic poverty as a public concern requiring public solutions. The scandal also influenced the development of professional social work. Early social reformers like Louisa Twining in England and Margaret Aylward in Ireland pointed to cases like Dublin as evidence that child welfare required trained professionals, not just well-meaning volunteers or profit-seeking administrators. Medical oversight of institutions improved as well. The scandal demonstrated that physicians needed to do more than treat illnesses. They needed to inspect conditions, question administrative decisions, and advocate for patients who couldn't advocate for themselves. This contributed to the development of public health medicine as a distinct specialty. But perhaps the most important implication was cultural. The scandal forced Victorians to confront uncomfortable truths about their society's treatment of fallen women and their children. The stigma attached to illegitimacy meant that thousands of infants were abandoned to institutions that operated with minimal resources and accountability. The scandal sparked debates about whether preventing unwanted pregnancies, supporting unmarried mothers, or reducing the severe social penalties for illegitimacy might be more humane than the existing system. While Victorian society wasn't ready to fully embrace these ideas, the conversation had begun. Similar scandals emerged in the scandal's wake. Investigations were launched at foundling hospitals across Ireland and Britain. Many revealed conditions comparable to Dublin, if not quite as spectacularly horrific. Mortality rates at these institutions were universally high. Oversight was universally inadequate. Embezzlement was common. The Bethlehem Hospital in London, investigated in 1841, was found to have infant mortality rates exceeding 80%. The Edinburgh Foundling Hospital, inspected in 1842, revealed bodies had been sold to medical schools without family consent. The Cork Foundling Hospital in Ireland, investigated in 1843, uncovered sexual abuse of older children by staff members. Each scandal built public pressure for reform. By the mid-1840s, government regulation of charitable institutions had increased dramatically across the British Empire. The psychological impact on survivors also deserves consideration. Children who lived in the Dublin Foundling Hospital during Mrs. Murphy's tenure grew up in an environment where death was omnipresent, and corpses were treated with disturbing casualness. While Victorian culture was generally more comfortable with death than our own, the conditions these children experienced exceeded normal exposure. Several of the older children who could remember the period before Dr. Walsh's reforms later described nightmares about cats, about the smell of the mortuary, about the casual way staff spoke of dead infants. In an era before psychological trauma was well understood or treated, these children had no framework for processing what they'd witnessed. The wet nurses and staff who'd worked under Murphy also carried psychological scars. Several left nursing entirely, unable to continue in a profession they associated with horror and helplessness. Others became fierce advocates for child welfare, channeling their trauma into activism. Thomas Kelly, the porter whose testimony was crucial to the investigation, struggled with guilt for not speaking out sooner. He'd obeyed Murphy's threats to protect his employment, and then watched the horror continue for weeks, before finally confiding in his brother. He reportedly told investigators, "I should have gone to the constabulary immediately. I should have risked my job. Those babies deserved someone brave enough to speak for them." His testimony resonates across history. How many of us faced with institutional power and personal vulnerability would act differently? Kelly eventually did the right thing, but only after extended internal struggle. His story reminds us that whistleblowing requires courage, and that systems often punish those who expose wrongdoing even as they're eventually vindicated. The question of animal behavior in this context also raises interesting considerations. The cats weren't evil, they were simply following natural instincts. Given access to food and lack of human interference, they did what feral cats do: they fed and multiplied. Their behavior exposed human failures. If the cats hadn't invaded the mortuary, if their population hadn't exploded, if they hadn't become bold enough to drag infant remains across courtyards in daylight, the scandal might have remained hidden much longer. In a dark irony, these animals revealed human cruelty that humans had worked to conceal. This pattern appears in other historical cases. Animals often expose abuse and neglect that humans hide. The presence of rats, maggots, or, as in this case, feral cats feeding where they shouldn't indicates breakdown in proper death care and human dignity. The Dublin scandal reminds us that institutional horror rarely involves active sadism. Mrs. Murphy wasn't a monster who delighted in suffering. She was a bureaucrat who prioritized money over duty, convenience over conscience. She rationalized each decision. Reducing burial frequency saved money. Ignoring cat problems avoided expense. Threatening Kelly protected her position. Each choice was small. Individually, none seemed monstrous. But collectively, they created conditions where infant corpses fed cats while administrators counted savings. This is how institutional evil often works, through accumulated small decisions, through prioritizing efficiency over humanity, through willful blindness to suffering that inconveniences the comfortable. The lesson reverberates through history. From Victorian foundling hospitals to modern nursing homes, from orphanages to immigrant detention centers, the pattern repeats. Vulnerable populations placed in underfunded, under-supervised institutions, where staff face impossible demands and administrators prioritize cost-cutting over care. The Dublin Foundling Hospital scandal of 1838 forced Victor Ian's society to confront these dynamics in an era when such confrontation was rare. The cats, unwittingly, became witnesses to crimes humans tried to hide. Their presence in the mortuary, their bold behavior, their increasing numbers, all signaled that something had gone terribly wrong. And when Dr. Richardson opened that mortuary door on March 14, 1838, the truth that animals had been exposing all along finally entered human consciousness. What do you think drove Mrs. Murphy to such prolonged negligence? Was it pure greed, or did the crushing demands of managing an underfunded institution gradually erode her moral compass? Could the wet nurses and staff have done more to expose the conditions earlier, or were they too trapped by poverty and powerlessness? Leave your theories in the comments below. Tell us what you think about institutional responsibility versus individual guilt in cases like this. If this dark chapter of Irish history affected you, subscribe to The Silent Abbey for more lost stories that shaped our world. These aren't just tales of the past. They're warnings for the present about what happens when we look away from suffering. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode. Share this with someone who needs to understand how easily human systems can fail the vulnerable. Thank you for watching and for bearing witness to these difficult truths. See you in the next video.